Hey, so I'm finally doing another review, an actual review again, since it's been ages. So I'm going to review Half a Life by Darren Strauss. It's a memoir, and it's actually one of the books I have to read for uni. So, yay! Yeah, reading heaps for uni. So, generally it's about, obviously, Darren Strauss. But when he was finishing up in high school, he was in a car accident. He was the actual driver that collided with the cyclist, and the cyclist actually died, and ended up being one of the girls from his school. And it talks about how he deals with the guilt of what happened, even though they say that it wasn't actually, like, he wasn't at fault at all, and that the bike just sort of swerved in front of him, and there was nothing he could have done to have prevented it. And it talks about how knowing what happened and knowing what he did, and even though he knew that there was nothing he could have done about it, just knowing that she was not going to experience everything that he had, and how that played on his mind throughout his whole life until he came to terms with it. It's just a really beautiful book. I cried a couple of times, but it's actually really, really good. It's like there were a few bits that really, really got me, which were the bits that it's hard to put it right, but like things like at the funeral, apparently her mother had said to him that, you have to live for two people now, because everything you do, you now have to do for her, because she's not going to be able to experience all of that. And how that had such a profound effect on him, and how every time he'd do something, no matter how small it was, even if it was just, he'd like the feeling of a cold can of Coke in his hand, and he'd think, this is a nice feeling, I like this feeling, and then he'd suddenly think, she's never going to feel this, she's never going to feel this again. And things like when he, went to college, and he found, he found the woman he would marry, and when he became a father and things, every single time he kept thinking to himself, she's never going to have the opportunity to do this, she's always going to be a high school kid, she's never going to grow older, she's never going to experience any of what he was at the time. It's really well written. I honestly don't have much to critique on it, negatively anyway. It's just a beautiful story. At the start you think, oh, how is this going to be, how is this going to be? But it sort of goes through and explains how things are and how things seem to him. It's like you could just, like, someone could simply just say, oh, I went into shock, or my body went into shock and it felt like blah blah. But, like, he explains it in his own little way. Like, for example, like I said about shock, I'll just read a little passage out. I've come to see our central nervous system as a kind of vintage switchboard, all thick foam wires, old-fashioned plugs. The circuitry isn't properly equipped. After a surplus of emotional information, the system overloads, the circuit breaks, and the board runs dark. That is what shock is. And I thought it was sort of nice. And there's little snippets like that that are just small ones, not even a paragraph, about things like that, just things, yeah. He talks a lot about how he felt a lot of guilt for it, and when people told him, we don't think it's your fault, or people who had nothing to do with it, who later discovered, would be really nice to him, and he explained how it just didn't feel right. Like, he wanted someone to just say, this is your fault, it's your fault, and just blame him, so that he felt like maybe it was okay to feel that guilt, that it was okay to feel bad for what happened, even if there wasn't anything he could do about it. I really honestly loved it. I thought it was actually a really very good book. First, when I thought, oh, you know, we have to read this, I'm not a huge fan of memoirs, but actually I honestly recommend it. It is an amazing book. It's really, really well done. It's only short, you can see it's only thin. It's probably about 200 pages. But it's an amazing book. It is a fabulous book, and I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I was told I had to read it. If I'd seen it on a shelf, I probably wouldn't have read it. I mean, even reading the blurb, it's like, oh, it's kind of interesting, but I probably wouldn't have picked it up and read it. But having read it, I'm glad that I did. I don't know. You really feel for him, and you really feel like it's not just you feel for him. You feel ridiculously empathetic in a sense, even though it's not really ridiculous. And it's just a really nice read, and I highly recommend it for anyone who might want something deep to read, because it is a really, really good book, and I honestly loved it in the 2 or 3 days it took me to read it. But yeah, it's definitely worth the time, and even if you don't have to read it for credit, but it's definitely worth the time. And I didn't at all find it difficult to read. It was actually really easy to read. Like I said, I read it in a couple of days. I was drawn in by it a lot. You know, I felt like I just started the book, and next thing you know, I was halfway through it, and it was 4 a.m. in the morning. But it's definitely worth it, and I highly recommend, if you can go get it, I highly recommend you do. It's a really, really good book, and I honestly loved it. It had a lot of cute footnotes in it as well, describing things and explaining things in more detail every now and again that would be somewhat helpful. Like, you don't need it, but I mean, you know, that's the point to a footnote. You don't really need it, but if you want it, you can read it. That sort of gave you that extra little bit. But yes, I highly recommend it. It is a great book. Read it. No, I'm being ridiculous now. But yes, no, I honestly recommend you read it. And if you are thinking of writing a memoir, read it as well. It's a really good example. It's